interesting. I've just talked about yin and yang coming into this world, like a shift to more yin for many people right now. And one of the things I noticed is what used to be very common. People would say, "I think that this is how it is. I think this is how he is. He is. I think this. I think that." To say "I think" is the number of times when people use "I think" is greatly reduced, and it has been replaced with "I feel." 50 years ago, 60 years ago, most people would still mostly say "I think," unless they were specifically talking about their feelings. But here, when you have an opinion, people no longer say "I think." I feel that. I do it sometimes too. I feel that is a shift, of course, from the yang, the conceptual thinking, to the yin. I feel. So that is fine, but can also be misleading. It's good to be open to your feelings, but it can also be misleading, because when you say "I feel something," it does not necessarily mean you are right. Just because you feel something doesn't mean this is the correct interpretation of reality. I feel something about this person or about this situation. It is a correct reflection of what you feel. That's fine. So you're honestly expressing your feelings. But that it may not be the case, or it may come from a deeper level too. But very often it does not come from a deeper level. It just is a reflection of your conditioning. So I feel, or do you ask, what do you feel about this situation? Well, I feel. Another interesting thing is that you can't argue that easily with "I feel." When somebody says "I feel that he is such and such a person," if you say "I think he is such and such a person," you say, "No, I think you're wrong." If you say "I feel he is such and such a person," you're absolutely not wrong. This is what you feel. It's hard to argue with the way somebody feels. Think kind of requires a bit more logical explanations. But if you have a feeling, it's just what I feel. So awareness is the key, as you know. Awareness is not a feeling. The feeling arises within the space of awareness. And the feeling, which may be an emotion coupled to a thought, it can be seen from the level of awareness. And then you can perhaps know whether it comes from a deeper level, an insight that you have, and it feels, then you can say, "This feels right." But you can't, not everybody who says "this feels right" is actually right about the situation. All he's saying that it feels right. Yes, that's true. But is it right? We don't know. When you feel something, it doesn't mean you're right. You may be right, but we don't know. Similarly, when you get angry about something, sometimes the more angry a person is about something, the more right they think they are. The more you can shout at other people, then that's proof that you're right. Of course, in many cases, it's proof that you're wrong. The awareness is there so that, and here's the key, so that you don't get taken over by thoughts or feelings. The real insights arise. They may be experienced as a kind of feeling because language is limited, but they're not really feelings. The real insights arise from awareness, not from a feeling. Since language is limited, we sometimes describe these as also feelings, but feelings. So awareness is the key. Without awareness, you can get taken over by thoughts or emotions or feelings without knowing it. You are being run by certain thoughts or emotions. And you think that's absolutely how it is. Lack of awareness or presence is the key that gives you immunity from mental viruses, because mental viruses can be more destructive than physical viruses. Mental viruses are thoughts that take over your mind. On a personal level, it's easy to recognize in another person. Some people are obsessed with one particular thought, and they interpret and certain associated thought, and then they interpret the whole of reality through the filter of those thoughts. People sometimes get infected with the weirdest thoughts, you can say, but then it's immediately recognized as a mental dysfunction. Somebody says, the earth has been taken over by aliens and I'm the only human left, for example. It's a weird thought that has crept into your mind. And then you go around the world and around the city and you look at all these aliens out there. And I'm the only human. I'm just giving one extreme example. It happens. The thought has occupied your mind and spreads into all areas of your mind. It's a virus. A mental virus has taken you over. Why? Because you believed in every thought that comes into your head. And this is just an extreme example, but in less extreme forms, it happens to many people. They don't know it, that they have been hijacked by thought or groups of thoughts. And then we have collective viruses in your mind. So people, certain ideas that float around in the collective, they enter your mind these days very frequently through the media, social media, all that, where people connect. This is a very dangerous place. There are lots of good opportunities too, but it's a very dangerous place because mental viruses can spread very easily through the technology that we have developed. They spread even before we had this technology. Mental viruses did spread. They could take over millions of people for a certain period of time and make them into maniacs. So we have certain political movements like that were extremely violent and destructive. Communism in Soviet Russia, the Maoist Cultural Revolution, millions died. National Socialism in Germany, Cambodia, the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia, where 1/3 of the population was killed. Where you look at these people, they have all gone insane, been taken over by a mental virus. And therefore, it was the psychologist Carl Jung said, the greatest danger for humanity is not some natural disaster or pandemic. The greatest danger for humanity is mass psychosis, collective psychosis. And that's absolutely true. And so for you to become immune, you need to be aware when you connect through technology, you connect with the internet and the social media and the mainstream media and other media and whatever it is, all the stuff that people, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and I don't even know the names. Be very careful. Without awareness, your mind can, together with millions of others' minds, can be taken over. And then you suddenly lose the ability to think rationally. To some extent, this is happening now. So there is a movement of lack of ability to think rationally among a certain segment of the population, a regressive movement, one could say, whereas another segment of the population is becoming more aware. A very interesting separation. You're becoming more aware, but a certain segment of the population are becoming less rational. They actually lose their ability to think rationally, temporarily. Eventually they will wake up. I mean, once you create enough suffering, eventually you wake up. So this is a very important topic, but you are, as I said at the beginning, you are on the right path. It's only awareness that can provide you with immunity to mental viruses, and that's really what it is. Two of the big religions of the world, in one of them, the central image of that religion, the absolutely central image, is a man who is being tortured and killed unfairly, and he is nailed to a cross. That is the central image of Christianity. Now, some people would say that is just awful. So how can people? Some people have a negative associations with church Christianity and say this is a terrible thing. This, well, depends how you look at it. There's also deep wisdom embedded in that, because it is the archetypal human. Archetypal means stands for all humans. The archetypal human, it points to the significance of suffering in the evolution of humanity, because that man on the cross also, he dies and is reborn, as the story goes. So if he hadn't died on the cross, he would not have been reborn. Buddha has it in more conceptual terms. Buddha describes his own teaching in the following words: I teach suffering and the end of suffering. That's a literal quote from the Buddha. A lot of Buddhist texts were actually written at a much later time, but it doesn't matter. But there are some utterances that I feel, I don't think, I feel, that I feel are actually true utterances of the Buddha, and this is one of them. I teach suffering, which means I show you how suffering arises in your mind. I teach suffering and the end of suffering, and I show you how suffering can come to an end. In the Christian image, you have the crucifixion and the resurrection. So you have suffering and the end of suffering. In Buddhism also, Buddha says, it is inevitable that you will find suffering until you awaken out of identification with form, identification with the psychological form of you, which the Buddha calls the self. If you don't recognize that that who you think you are is ultimately an illusion, the self, the mind-made self, as long as that you suffer, as long as that happens. When you recognize it as an illusion, you transcend suffering. That's the end of suffering. The evolution for humanity and for every human being is to suffer and then reach the end of suffering. And the end of suffering is the awakening. The motivating power, the power behind that makes awakening possible is suffering, until you reach the point where you realize that you don't need it anymore. You need it until you reach this point, the brink of awakening, that you don't need to suffer anymore. Now, the suffering is the encounter of extreme disruption in your life, extreme limitation in your life, the infliction of violence on your body and on your mind. All those things are extreme forms of limitation and disruption. Some children are born already into a terrible environment where I don't know whether that is also your case, but where the parents are very unconscious and they cannot help but perpetuate their unconsciousness and inflict it on their children also, and so on. So some are born already into that, and others encounter suffering at a somewhat later stage, when suddenly they're confronted with accident, illness, serious loss in their lives, approaching death or the death of people close to you, suddenly ending up with nothing anymore. You're nobody, you're put into prison, whatever it may be. In other words, your life becomes very painful. Your life is full of who you are as a form identity, as the self, becomes unbearable. So for example, I've seen people, spoken to people who have awakened in prison cells after years in prison, very dreadful conditions. And you could say, of course, they're suffering there because the extreme limitation and unpleasantness and dreadful possibility of violence every day. And suddenly something in them happened, which one could describe as they couldn't stand it anymore. And there was no solution on the outer level. If you're in prison, not much you can do. Well, you can try to escape, but you may not succeed. So there's no solution on the outer level, your external situation. The only possibility is transcendence. And transcendence is achieved through surrender. Surrender means everything that resisted the conditions of your life drops away. Everything that resists any situation, especially the present moment in your life, it drops away. So you're forced into presence by suffering. And it's happened to some people without any help of spiritual teachings or books. Some people did it organically. And suddenly they find deep inner peace in the same situation because they're not complaining anymore on any level, neither mental nor emotional. There's a deep surrender that's expressed in Christianity. Jesus is supposed to have said, "Not my will, but thy will be done." And also the gesture on the cross is one of surrender too. I bought a little image of it. We were in Assisi, which is in Italy, where Saint Francis lived. There's a cross that somebody painted of Jesus, even on the cross, very old. It was already, and this cross is supposed to have spoken to Saint Francis. And anyway, long story short, there you have a Jesus who is not suffering anymore. He's still on the cross, but he's totally at peace. He's not in agony. It's just complete surrender. He's not smiling, but he's not in agony at all. And he's like voluntarily, virtually. He doesn't even look as if he's nailed to it anymore. It's just voluntarily, just is there. I love that cross. He has already transcended, even on the cross, already transcended. These are deep wisdom teachings, not conveyed through words or concepts, but conveyed in a different way, through images and so on. It's not only human beings. There's a radical life for every life form is precarious, and there is suffering. Every life form experiences suffering on some level. Every animal will experience suffering. Of course, the less consciousness there is, the less the suffering actually experienced. Like a tree in certain conditions probably also suffers, but not as consciously. The more conscious you are, the more acute the suffering becomes. And that is, humans are those who suffer the most, one could say. Without obstacles in your life, without hindrances, without limitations, you would not evolve as a human being at all. It's the limitation, and on every level. I sometimes give an example, even on a physical level. What do you do if you want your body to get stronger? What do you do? Well, you have to exercise. You have to weight lift. You have to go, whatever you do, you go jogging, whatever you do. Now, I put it differently. What are you really doing when you're doing that? Now, I put this in slightly little strange, peculiar terms. In order to make your body stronger, you have to make life difficult for your body. Because lifting a heavy weight, you're not making life easier for your body. Your body would probably rather lie on a sofa and be a couch potato. You have to lift the weight, or you have to go jogging. oh my God. I mean, you're making demands on your body. Your life gets very difficult for your body. And at some point, now when things get difficult, there is a demand for more energy on whatever level. It's energy, or ultimately it's all consciousness in different vibrational frequencies. On a physical level, make your life difficult for the body is a demand for more energy, because for the body to cope with these difficulties, more energy is called for, and the body calls for more energy. And then at some point, as you exercise, there is an influx of renewed energy. And at that point, it's not difficult anymore. The body actually enjoys this influx of energy. And suddenly you enjoy the running or the jogging or the weightlifting. You enjoy. If life had not become difficult for the body, the influx of energy would not have happened. Similarly, and on whatever level, if you experience limitation, like there are countless examples. In ancient Greece, there was a very famous orator. To be public speaking was highly regarded in both ancient Greece and Rome. There was a very famous orator whose name escapes me, but he was born with a speech defect, so he couldn't talk properly. And people were always making fun of him. He couldn't, whenever he tried to form a sentence, the words didn't come out. And what he did the story goes, he went to the seashore and he put little pebbles in his mouth and tried to speak. Pebbles, I don't know, to make an extra effort to speak. The pebbles made it even harder to speak. And he talked to the sea. And he practiced for several years. I don't know how many, nobody knows. 2 years, whatever, 3 years, talking to the sea. And finally, he overcame the speech defect because he spent so much time talking to the seashore, to the ocean. And then he became the most famous orator in Greece. There was an intense demand for influx of energy because of the limitation. The more limitation there is, the greater the demand for change. Similarly, if you have in a good work of literature, a novel, or even in a good movie, you have a certain character. In almost every movie, unless it's a comedy, but I suppose even a comedy, in every movie, the story is basically something needs to go wrong for the characters in order for the movie to exist, because otherwise nobody's interested. If the character is not confronted with any problems, nobody would want to watch that movie. I mean, imagine a beautiful cruise from Southampton to New York where nothing goes wrong, but everybody's having a wonderful time on this big ship called the Titanic. That movie would never have happened. It would not be very interesting. Watch 2.5 hours of people cruising on the Titanic from England to New York. Every character needs to be confronted with limitation, challenges, and difficulties. The character, or the main character, that is the beginning of the plot of the movie. It has to start with something going wrong. If nothing goes wrong, there's no evolution, there's no development, nothing. In a good movie, as the character is confronted with problems, he or she eventually begins to change. Sometimes the character is very dysfunctional or has a huge ego, and then things happen to him or her. And then life gets more and more difficult. And then the character has to generate energies of whatever level in order to overcome or transcend the difficulties, the limitations that arise. And that becomes the movie. And then at the end of the movie, or the novel, like literature, the character has changed, has deepened through the suffering, is no longer dominated by ego, has had deep insights into life. And this is how literature and good movies can also help the viewer or the reader to participate to some extent in the transformation of the character, because to some extent, when you read a really good novel or you see a good movie or theater, to some extent you will identify with the character. And if the character goes through a shift, first the character suffers. Often the character suffers because of his or her dysfunctional conditioning. Character creates his own suffering. And then if you had identified with the character, you can participate a little bit in the shift in consciousness that's happening to the character. And that is the transformative power of great literature, because it gives you a deepened insight into the human condition and the possibilities of the human condition. And so wherever you look, if a gardener plants whatever it may be, a bulb of a flower in the soil, quite often the gardener puts extra soil on top to make it more difficult when the sprouts, to make it more difficult to push through the soil for the stalk to come up. Another example, if you plant a plant in a greenhouse where conditions are perfect, it'll grow very quickly, and then you take it outside, it'll die very easily because it hasn't developed the necessary resistance, doesn't have the necessary energy that could only have come with experiencing limitation and difficulty. And then even the tree and the plant will then demand more energy. Not consciously, but there is a certain consciousness embedded in every plant. All life forms are manifestations in different degrees of the one consciousness. So every life form experiences even being born is the first difficulty. So precarious. I mean, every animal that's being born, every human being born, in the past, childbirth was the most common form of death, was death of the baby or the mother giving birth to the baby. Everything is precarious, and the evolution is dependent on challenges, which for quite a while I experienced as suffering until the breakthrough happens, and then the suffering has fulfilled its purpose. And then, yes, you continue to evolve, but you are a conscious participant in the evolution now, as you are, because you are here. You know that you can evolve without needing more suffering. You will get challenges, of course. There's no end to challenges, but there's no longer a need to transform the challenges into suffering. That is the difference. So the transcendence is already happening, and be grateful. Maybe, I don't know whether you've already reached that point, but you will if you haven't reached it yet, where you can be grateful for your suffering retrospectively, as I am for my suffering. The unconsciousness of the collective is amplified by our technology, of course. It does not mean that you cannot, the expression you used, I think you said, take a stance, which means to participate in some way in the discourse that happens in the world of the internet and all that. There's people are continuously talking to each other. And there's also the secondary thing is, of course, action. Is there any desirability of taking action? What kind of action? Taking a stance. Most important thing is there's nothing wrong with expressing your viewpoint or opinion, because I'm sure you have viewpoints and opinions. The important thing is not to confuse opinion and identity. That's when you lose yourself. When an opinion, which is your mental position, your viewpoint, your opinion, if you unconsciously you equate that with your identity, then you begin to fight against other humans who have different opinions or identities that clash with yours. And again, the key to becoming free of this delusion of equating opinion and identity is to have an identity that transcends, to find your true identity that transcends thought, that is beyond thought and beyond the personality. Again, that's what we started with today, and which continuously in the background of what we are talking about here, in the background, is that to be rooted in the awareness, even while you express an opinion. It might be a political opinion on the left, on the right, whatever it may be, and you express your opinion, and somebody else may attack your opinion. First, you'd ask yourself, what is the point? Am I making a useful contribution to the world by expressing this opinion? That's an interesting question. Is this helping anybody? Or are you trying to convince people that you are right and they are wrong? You're probably not going to succeed in that. The other person will become more deeply entrenched in their opinions if you try to prove them wrong. Are you engaged in an egoic endeavor, which is simply make others wrong and make yourself right? And the world of the internet is full of people who are engaged in that practice of making themselves right and others wrong. And by doing that, the ego feels an enhanced sense of identity. In other words, you become more deluded, ever more deluded of who you are. Is there any point in participating? In some discussions, there may be some point. Perhaps you can put forward information that people did not have. Perhaps you have it, and you can show, instead of engaging in some kind of fight, which is always egoic, put forward some information and see that's how it is, that those are the facts. And even then, people may dislike your facts and not want to see them. But whatever it is, you can participate in the discourse with wisdom, with awareness, so that you don't create enemies. Nobody is your enemy. Another question is action. What action can I take? Your first responsibility is always, in the same way that on aeroplanes, when they announce what to do when the airbag comes down from the ceiling, when the air pressure, in case, they always say, in case there's a loss of air pressure, these oxygen bags will come down from the ceiling and you're supposed to put them on your mouth. And they always say, if you're with a child, put it on yours first and then on the child. Because if you put it on the child first, you may lose consciousness a second after that and you can't help the child anymore. Your state of consciousness is the foundation for your experience of this world. Your state of consciousness is the foundation for whatever you do or say. So you give primary importance to your state of consciousness, and then, which means be aware, be present. Don't be just trapped in the conditioned mind. Be present, be aware. And once you know that your primary responsibility is your state of consciousness, because that's the foundation for everything, that affects the world in many ways. Not only in ways that where people you come into contact with could be affected in a good way by your state of consciousness. Even people you are not in contact with can be affected by your state of consciousness, because everything is connected underneath the surface of the phenomenal world. Everything is connected, and every human is connected to every other human. Ultimately, there's a collective of humanity that is one consciousness there's the consciousness of humanity, which is an aspect of the greater consciousness of the universe. So one could say there's ultimately only one human being on this earth, and this one human being, there's one human consciousness, which is only an aspect of the universal consciousness. This one human consciousness expresses itself in billions of short-lived forms. They come and go. Every human form is, from a cosmic scale, every human form appears on this planet like a flash of light appearing. That was you. That was me. Lights flashing, and one consciousness. There's only one light, but it appears in many forms. So once you take responsibility for your state of consciousness and continue to realize that that is primary, then you can take some action and you will know what is right. You can use wisdom then. Through wisdom, you will know whether there's anything you can do, because there are many problems in this world. Where do you want to take some action? Which is the most important one to you? So there's a huge choice if you want to take action, but never lose yourself in the action, because all the things that are dysfunctional in this world, the suffering in this world, to a greater extent is created by human dysfunction, the dysfunction that is inherent in the collective human mind, which is the personal ego and the collective ego. So there is a deep dysfunction in the human mind. It's a kind of mental illness. And that mental illness in the collective human mind manifests itself in many different forms. Warfare is one of them, and there are many other forms. The greater part of human suffering, if you want to look, it might be easier to have a little bit of perspective, look at the history of the 20th century, and you can see the countless millions that were killed, humans killing each other by the millions. The incredible suffering that took place there, most of it was not caused by natural catastrophes. Some was, but not most of it was caused by other humans doing it to other humans. That were the greater part of human suffering is caused by humans do it to each other. And this is why it's so important, this shift in consciousness, because we would undoubtedly destroy ourselves if there is no shift in consciousness. The dysfunction was already there even before we created the technology that we now have. The dysfunction was already there, but it was never life-threatening because humans did not have the power to destroy themselves. But now the dysfunction is still there, but now the humans have the power to destroy themselves and the planet if nothing changes. This is right now, for the first time in human history, change in consciousness is no longer an option or a luxury, one could almost say, but a necessity for humanity to survive. A change in consciousness is necessary, and you need to embody that before you take any action, or while you take action. You need to embody that changed consciousness so that you don't get drawn into the unconsciousness of the world while you participate in things. And an important thing is not to hold your viewpoints loosely. Don't derive your sense of self from your viewpoints. Your sense of self must come from a deeper place. Then you remain conscious in this world. If your sense of self comes from your viewpoints and opinions, in other words, from your thoughts, then you're lost again. Because before you get lost in the world, you have to get lost in your thoughts, because ultimately they are one. Lost in thought lost in the world. It's ultimately the same thing. You lose yourself. So don't lose yourself. Some humans withdraw completely from the world. That's an option that depending on the situation. For example, let's say you find yourself in a collective, in a country or part of the country where things are dysfunctional and violent things are happening. Up to a point, you can participate in, because your input and your actions might be helpful in bringing some consciousness into an unconscious situation. Sometimes the unconscious situation has progressed to such an extent that the world around you is so insane that you can see, when you are rooted in wisdom, you can see there's nothing you can do at this point. For example, before a destructive political movement arises, as it arises, perhaps there's still some possibility of bringing some consciousness. When you see unconsciousness arising, another wave of madness arising, because madness is not only underlying the craziness of this world, there's waves when the craziness of the madness of this world gets amplified and it becomes very destructive. Sometimes you can still take action as you see the wave of unconsciousness arising, happening now, for example, in many countries. But sometimes a point is reached where the environment becomes so deeply unconscious that you can see there's no longer anything you can do. Then you would just have to remove yourself completely. Only wisdom can know what is